We thought they would whip us. Instead, they handed us reins." That single sentence, whispered decades later by former prisoner Helga Richter, still carried the weight of disbelief. In 1944, when her train of captured German women rolled through the endless Texas plains, every woman inside expected punishment, humiliation, and hard labor. The war had stripped them of everything: rank, pride, homeland. Now they thought America would strip away the rest. The train slowed under a blazing sun. Dust whirled like smoke across the tracks. As the women stepped down, they shielded their eyes, expecting barking guards, rifles, and orders. Instead, they saw men in wide-brimmed hats, cowboys, not soldiers. Their rifles slung easy, their postures calm. These Texans didn't look like conquerors. One of them, tall and sunburned, grinned and tipped his hat. "Welcome to Texas, ladies. Hope you like horses." The words made no sense. Horses? Some of the women laughed bitterly, others stiffened in silence. But as the hours passed, the truth emerged. This was no ordinary prison. The camp stood on the edge of a cattle ranch, miles from the nearest town. Barbed wire surrounded it, yes, but so did stables, corrals, and open pastures. Instead of barracks full of chains, they saw rows of wooden bunks with clean sheets. Helga, a 28-year-old former Luftwaffe radio operator, kept waiting for the cruelty to begin. The Americans must be pretending, she thought. No victor treats their enemies with such ease. That evening, when the sun dipped into the red horizon, the prisoners were assembled by a group of cowboys turned guards. The head of the group, Caleb Stone, a ranch foreman drafted into POW4 duty, looked them over. "You'll be working the ranch with us," he said plainly. "We feed the horses, mend the fences, and take care of the land. If you pull your weight, you'll do just fine. No shouting, no threats, just quiet authority." A younger prisoner asked nervously, "Do we wear chains?" Caleb blinked, confused. "Chains, no, ma'am. You need both hands free to ride." Laughter rippled among the guards, but the German women froze. Ride? Surely it was a joke. The next morning, Caleb returned with 3 horses, sleek, restless, and unsaddled. He pointed at Helga. "You first. You've got good posture." "Ever ridden?" "Only trains," she muttered. "Then today is your lucky day." Helga hesitated. Her training as a German officer's assistant told her to refuse, to maintain distance, dignity. But there was something in Caleb's steady patience that disarmed her. She stepped forward, resting her hand on the horse's neck. The animal shifted, but didn't shy away. Its warmth felt shockingly alive under her palm. "Bareback's about trust," Caleb said. "You don't force it, you listen." The phrase echoed strangely in her mind. Trust, a word long forbidden in her world. The first attempt ended predictably with Helga in the dust, gasping while the Americans chuckled softly. But instead of ridicule, Caleb offered his hand. "You'll do better next time." By sundown, her thighs burned, her hands blistered, and her pride was in ruins. Yet something new flickered beneath the exhaustion. A faint sense of calm. For the first time since capture, she wasn't thinking of defeat or survival. She was thinking of balance, rhythm, and breath. As night fell, she sat on the fence line, watching the cowboys lead the horses back to the corral. The smell of hay and wood smoke filled the air. In the distance, someone strummed a guitar. Helga turned to one of the other women and whispered, "They put us on horses, not in chains." The woman didn't answer. She just stared out at the open sky. Too wide, too free, too kind for war. On the long voyage from Europe to America, fear was their only companion. The German propaganda machine had done its work well. To the women aboard the crowded transport ship, America was a land of monsters. Newspapers and military briefings had warned them that captured soldiers were tortured, starved, and forced into labor until death. The phrase whispered between prisoners was, "America ist Ende, America is the end." Helga Richter remembered the whispers below deck. "They'll shave our heads. They'll brand us like cattle. They'll make us dig graves." The rumors filled the hold like smoke. Even the officers, usually stoic, avoided eye contact when those words surfaced. To be captured was shame enough. To be captured by Americans, the supposed materialistic, vengeful enemy, was unthinkable. But as the ship neared New Orleans, something odd happened. From the deck, the women could see harbor workers waving, smiling, even throwing candy toward the German POWs. It felt absurd, impossible. Was this some kind of trick? When they disembarked, military police were polite but firm. The women were processed, documented, and divided into groups. There were no screams, no beatings, only paperwork and quiet efficiency. By the time the train headed west, the prisoners sat in stunned silence. The cars rattled across flat plains, the air dry and bright. Occasionally civilians appeared along the tracks, farmers, children, even mothers waving from distant porches. One child held up a sign, "Welcome to Texas." Some laughed bitterly. Others turned away, unable to reconcile the kindness with everything they'd been told. That night, as the train stopped near a small station, Helga noticed the guards weren't armed for battle. Their rifles were slung lazily. Some men shared cigarettes with one another. They spoke in that peculiar Texan drawl, gentle, musical, almost lazy. When a guard noticed Helga watching, he smiled and offered a canteen of water through the bars. She hesitated before taking it. The water was cool and clean. He nodded. "You'll need that. Texas gets hotter than hell's doorstep." The casual humor confused her. He was supposed to hate her, wasn't he? She wanted to ask him why he didn't, but the train lurched forward before she could. The next morning, as dawn broke over the endless plains, the fear that had followed the women across the Atlantic began to dissolve slowly, painfully. Outside the windows, fields of mesquite and longhorn cattle stretched into the horizon. It didn't look like an enemy's country. It looked alive, untamed, and strangely peaceful. Helga whispered to herself, "If this is prison, then what is freedom?" When the train finally stopped, the guards didn't shout. They opened the doors and told the women to step down one by one. There were no chains, no dogs, just the smell of dust and sunlight, and the distant sound of someone hammering wood in the heat. A small wooden sign read Camp Hereford, Prisoner of War Branch. Inside, they were met by a camp officer who introduced himself with a polite nod. "You are under our protection," he said. "You will be treated as soldiers, not slaves. Do your duty, and you will be respected." For many of the women, it was the first time an enemy had spoken to them as equals. That night in their bunks, the camp lights glowing faintly through the windows, Helga lay awake. The fear that had once seemed unshakable was crumbling. The war was still raging across the ocean. But here, in the stillness of the Texas night, something else had begun, a quiet war within themselves. They had expected cruelty and chains. Instead, they found dignity. And for the first time in years, Helga dared to hope that not everything she'd been told about the world was true. The first morning at Camp Hereford began not with the clang of chains, but with the low call of a bugle and the smell of bacon frying somewhere beyond the fence. The sound of hooves, the whinny of horses, and the buzz of cicadas filled the air. The German women rose slowly, confused. They expected harsh orders or rations of stale bread. Instead, breakfast consisted of eggs, potatoes, and even coffee, hot, sweet, and abundant. One of the older women, a nurse named Inge, stared at her tin plate and muttered, "They feed prisoners like officers." Helga didn't reply. She was too busy watching the guards who sat nearby eating the same food, laughing softly about cattle prices and the weather. It was almost domestic, ordinary. The most disarming thing about Texas, she realized, was its normalcy. The camp itself was a strange contradiction. Military precision and ranch informality coexisting under one sky. Barbed wire defined its perimeter, but inside the prisoners moved with a degree of freedom. There were barracks, stables, a small infirmary, even a recreation area. When Helga was assigned to stable duty, she braced for cruelty. Instead, she found herself learning the names of horses. Caleb Stone, the cowboy-turned-guard who had first greeted her, oversaw the animal teams. His rules were simple: no laziness, no lies, no yelling at horses. He worked alongside the prisoners, sweating, repairing fences, and speaking to them as if they were co-workers instead of captives. At first, the women mistrusted him. It seemed like another American trick to win them over with kindness before revealing the trap. But kindness, repeated daily without demand or deceit, began to feel less like deception and more like truth. One afternoon, as they mended a fence line under the brutal sun, Caleb handed Helga his canteen. "You're not drinking enough," he said. She hesitated. "You'll get in trouble for that," he laughed. "Not unless you tell on me." She took a sip. The water was warm but refreshing. "Why do you treat us this way?" she asked finally. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Because you're people. War doesn't change that." It was a simple answer, but one that struck her harder than any propaganda speech she'd ever heard. Over the next weeks, the women learned routines: feeding horses, repairing tack, tending vegetable gardens. Work that once felt humiliating began to feel grounding. The rhythm of the ranch replaced the rhythm of the military. They learned to listen to the wind, to the horses, and to the easy drawl of Texans who didn't seem to carry the hatred Europe expected of them. Helga began keeping a journal. Her first entries were cold, clinical, guarded. But by midsummer her tone shifted. She wrote, "They treat us as if we were guests, not captives. Perhaps freedom is not a place but a way of being." The other women changed too. They smiled more. They sang while they worked. One of them, Elsa, began sketching the Cowboys, laughing as they posed with mock heroism. The Americans pinned her drawings in the mess hall. There was still a fence, still guards, still a war. But somehow in the Texas sun, it all seemed less real. At night, the prisoners would gather by the barracks, staring at the stars sprawling endlessly across the sky. The silence of the plains felt like forgiveness itself. Helga would whisper to herself, "If this is captivity, then it is the gentlest prison in the world." Summer deepened over the Texas plains, turning every day into a furnace. The heat shimmered above the camp fences, and work began before sunrise. The German women had become part of the daily rhythm of ranch life, tending horses, patching fences, and helping with harvest chores on nearby farms. What began as forced labor had become strangely a kind of community. One morning a rancher named Mr. Hawkins rode into camp. He was tall, leathery, and spoke with the easy confidence of a man born in the saddle. "Got word we're short on hands for the roundup," he said. "You boys mind lending me a few of your lady prisoners?" The guards looked uneasy, but Caleb just grinned. "They can handle it. They're tougher than half my unit." And so 4 women, Helga among them, were selected to ride out under escort for what the Americans called light ranch work. The convoy rolled past the gates. The guards relaxed but watchful. For the first time, the women saw open plains without barbed wire cutting the horizon. The grass waved like the sea. Herds of longhorns dotted the distance. The sight stole their breath. When they reached the Hawkins ranch, the work began immediately. Horses needed saddling, fences mending, and cattle driven toward the corral. The women hesitated until the cowboys tossed them ropes and gloves. "You can stand around," one teased. "Or you can help earn lunch." They chose to help. Helga worked beside Caleb, learning to guide cattle with shouts and sweeping motions. The animals moved like living thunder, their hooves pounding the earth. Sweat soaked her shirt, dust coated her skin, but she didn't care. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by rank or uniform. She was just a person doing honest work. When one steer broke from the herd, Helga sprinted after it, reckless, driven by instinct. Caleb whistled sharply. "Easy. Don't spook it." But she kept running, waving her arms until the animal slowed, confused. The cowboys whooped, cheering her back. By noon, the roundup was done. Mr. Flastidnind. Hawkins brought out lunch. Grilled beef, bread, beans, and iced tea. The prisoners sat apart at first, wary of impropriety, but Caleb waved them over. "Ain't no law against eating," he said. "You're working folks today, not prisoners." The women hesitated, then joined. The food was simple, rich, and hot. The kind of meal that made the world feel whole again. Laughter drifted between accents, German and English blending into something human and new. Elsa, the artist, sketched one of the cowboys balancing a plate in his lap. "You look like a hungry philosopher," she teased. He grinned. "Guess that makes you my painter, huh?" For a few hours, the war truly vanished. Later that evening, as they rode back toward camp, the setting sun painted everything gold. Helga leaned forward on her horse, feeling the animal's steady rhythm beneath her. The guards didn't rush them. The horizon stretched wide, limitless, like a glimpse of the freedom she'd forgotten existed. When they reached the gates, one guard saluted them jokingly. "You folks survived the Texas range," Helga smiled. "Barely," she said. That night she wrote in her journal, "Today we worked beside the enemy, and it felt like working beside friends." Maybe peace begins when no one remembers which side they're on. The next morning, she awoke sore and sunburned, but lighter. Something sacred had passed between captors and captives on that plane. Not words, not promises, just shared sweat, laughter, and the strange grace of a Texas afternoon. And somewhere in the dust of that day, hatred quietly died. By autumn, the women of Camp Hereford had stopped counting the days. The war in Europe raged on. But here in Texas, time moved differently, slow, golden, and patient. The fence was still there, the sentries still patrolled. But inside, the air no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of hay, sweat, and sometimes even laughter. Yet not everyone accepted this strange peace. A few among the German prisoners whispered about weakness, how the Americans had dulled their pride, softened their spirit. "We are soldiers of the Reich," one woman hissed during supper. "We should not thank our captors." Helga didn't answer. She only stared at her hands, still calloused from ranch work, remembering how Caleb had trusted her with the reins, the rope, the open land. That night, lying in her bunk, she tried to make sense of it all, the war she'd been taught to fight versus the world she now saw. It was like holding two opposite truths in her hands. One of hatred, one of humanity, and only one felt real anymore. The next morning, news swept through the camp. Another Allied bombing over Germany. Dozens of cities burned, hundreds dead. The guards didn't gloat. They simply lowered their voices when speaking to the prisoners. "It'll be over soon," one said softly. For some, that news broke them. For others, it brought relief. But for Helga, it awakened something deeper, a question she could no longer ignore. What had all this destruction been for? Days later, a truck arrived at the camp loaded with supplies, feed for horses, barrels of water, and a crate of old radio parts. The guards asked for help unloading, and Helga volunteered. As she lifted a box, a small transistor radio fell to the ground, cracked but still humming faintly. A guard shrugged. "Keep it if you can fix it." That night in the dim barracks, Helga and Elsa tinkered with the wires. By some miracle, it crackled to life. The signal drifted through static, then a voice, calm American, reading the news. "You, sir. Forces have liberated Paris. Allied bombers hit synthetic fuel plants in Germany. Civilian casualties high." The room went silent. For a moment, it was as if the walls themselves were listening. Elsa turned the dial and caught a softer program. Jazz music. Smooth, playful, utterly foreign to their ears. Helga whispered, "They play music after news of death." Inga, the nurse, replied, "Maybe that's how they survive." In that moment, the math of war began to collapse in Helga's mind. In Germany, loss was met with fury. Here, loss was met with resilience, with creation. Weeks later, during a visit from Red Cross officials, one American guard slipped Helga a folded newspaper clipping. "Thought you'd want this," he said. It was an article about women working in factories, Rosie the riveter smiling with a wrench in her hand. The headline read, "She builds bombers so he can fly them." Helga read it over and over, mesmerized. The Americans didn't hide their women. They celebrated them. She remembered Caleb's words. "War doesn't change that you're people." Maybe she thought it didn't have to. But not everyone saw it that way. That night, the same prisoner who had accused them of weakness confronted her again. "You're forgetting who you are," she spat. Helga met her gaze calmly. "No," she said. "I'm remembering who I was before the war." For that she was reported to the camp commandant. But the officer only smiled wearily and said, "If that's your crime, Fräulein Voss, I wish the world had more of it." As winter rolled in, the fences of Camp Hereford still stood, but their meaning had changed. The women were no longer prisoners of the war outside. They were captives of a revelation that compassion could be stronger than ideology, that respect could disarm hate, and that somewhere in Texas they had found the humanity Germany had lost. December 1944, a cold front swept across Texas, rare and biting. The mesquite trees stood bare, and the wind carried a faint smell of wood smoke. Inside Camp Hereford, the prisoners were given extra blankets and heavier coats, small kindnesses that to women who had expected cruelty felt almost unreal. That morning, an announcement echoed across the yard. The guards were organizing a Christmas event. Volunteers needed for decorations, one shouted. Laughter rippled through the German women. Christmas for prisoners. Helga exchanged glances with Inge and Elsa. Is this a joke? Inge asked. But it wasn't. Within hours, the mess hall was alive with motion. Americans and prisoners worked side by side, stringing paper garlands, cutting stars from tinfoil, and arranging pine branches brought in from a nearby ranch. Even the commandant lent his voice to the effort, grumbling, but secretly smiling. In the afternoon, a new surprise arrived. 3 horses saddled and brushed. Caleb appeared beside them, grinning beneath his hat. You ladies up for a little Christmas ride? The prisoners stared at him, speechless. You can't be serious, Helga said. Dead serious, he replied. We'll ride the outer pasture. No rifles, no guards, just a bit of wind before supper. The commandant hesitated, but finally nodded. Fine, but stay close. And so just before sunset, 4 German women and 2 cowboys rode through the gate of Camp Hereford, not as enemies, not as prisoners, but as riders. The air was crisp, the sky vast, and painted with streaks of violet and gold. For a moment, even the barbed wire seemed to disappear into the distance. The horses trotted slowly at first, then faster. As the riders gained confidence, Helga's heart pounded, not from fear but from a strange, forgotten joy. The wind tore at her hair, and the sound of hooves filled her chest with a rhythm older than war. Caleb rode beside her, his voice carrying over the wind. You know, back home we say riding clears the soul. She smiled faintly. Maybe the soul is all that's left after war. He nodded. Then keep it free. When they stopped by a small ridge, the sun had almost set. From there they could see the camp below. Tiny, peaceful, haloed in golden light. The women fell silent. For years they had watched the world through walls, through orders, through fear. Now, for the first time, they saw it open and endless. Caleb dismounted, pulling something from his saddlebag. It was a small tin, slightly dented. Inside were cookies, real ones, dusted with sugar. My ma sent these, he said. She said, share with someone who needs them more. Helga took one, hesitant, then bit into it. The taste of butter and sugar nearly brought her to tears. She turned away, ashamed of her emotion. Caleb noticed, but said nothing. The ride back was quiet, almost sacred. When they returned, the other prisoners crowded around, eager to hear what had happened. Elsa described the sunset in broken English, her eyes shining. Inge just smiled and said softly, For an hour, I was free. That night, the guards and prisoners shared a Christmas dinner together. Roast chicken, bread, and even Coca-Cola. They sang songs, German and English, blending awkwardly but beautifully. Helga's journal entry that night was short. They let us ride. They gave us cookies. They sang with us. The war is still on, but tonight no one fought. Outside, frost began to form on the ground. Inside, under the weak glow of the camp's lights, something unbreakable was born. A truth that neither victory nor defeat could erase, that humanity once shared can never be taken back. Spring returned to the Texas plains with the smell of dust and wild flowers. By now, Camp Hereford had settled into a rhythm that blurred the lines between captivity and community. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the news came slowly, filtered through radios and Red Cross letters. Inside the camp, the guards found ways to keep spirits high. Softball games, sing-alongs, even small rodeos. One bright afternoon, Caleb and a few ranch hands rolled in with a trailer of horses and barrels. We're holding a rodeo, he announced, tipping his hat toward the prisoners. Y'all are welcome to watch or compete if you've got the grit. The German women laughed nervously, unsure if he was serious. Compete against cowboys. But Caleb wasn't joking. You've been working with horses long enough, he said. Time to see what you've learned. It was absurd, and yet, by midday, the camp's dirt field had transformed into a makeshift arena. Guards, prisoners, and even the camp cook gathered to watch. Someone painted a crude sign that read, P.W. Rodeo. The first event was barrel racing. The Americans went first, riding fast and confident, kicking up trails of dust. When it was the women's turn, the crowd hushed. Helga mounted Belle, the same mare she had learned to ride months before. Her heart thudded in her chest. Caleb leaned over the fence. "Remember what I told you. Don't fight her. Trust her." Helga nodded, then whispered to Belle in German, "We've done harder things, haven't we?" The horse snorted softly, as if in reply. When the signal came, they were off. Belle surged forward, hooves pounding the dirt. Helga leaned low, guiding her through the first barrel, then the second. The crowd roared. Dust and sunlight swirled together, and for those few moments, there was no war, no past, only speed, balance, and breath. When she crossed the finish line, the cheers erupted. Even the officers applauded. Helga's time was only seconds behind the best cowboys. Caleb clapped, laughing. "Well, I'll be damned." "You're ready for the circuit." She dismounted, grinning despite herself. "You mean I win?" Caleb shrugged. "You win the bragging rights, ma'am." Then came the roping event. Elsa, ever the artist, volunteered. Her first attempts were comical, the rope landing nowhere near the target. But with every try, she grew better until finally she looped the dummy steer cleanly. The crowd cheered again. What began as a simple diversion became something larger. A bridge of dust, laughter, and mutual respect. Even the strictest guards relaxed, smiling openly. For that hour, no one thought of nations or uniforms. Later, as the sun dipped low, the cowboys shared lemonade and biscuits with the prisoners. One guard raised a toast. "To the bravest riders in Texas," he said, and everyone, Americans and Germans alike, laughed and clinked tin cups. As twilight fell, Helga found herself beside the fence, watching the horizon glow red and gold. Caleb stood next to her, silent for a while before saying, "Funny thing, ain't it? How folks can start as enemies and end up like this." She nodded slowly. "In Germany they told us you were savages, but you taught us to ride, to live. Perhaps the lie was ours." Caleb smiled faintly. "Truth's like a horse. It'll buck you till you learn to hold on." "Then I think we finally learned," she said. As the sun dipped low, they stood in silence. Not as captor and captive, not even as cowboy and prisoner, but as two souls who had seen the best of humanity in the midst of its worst. Years later, after both had passed, locals would find that spot beneath the oak marked by a simple plaque placed by Helga's family. It read, "Here, once enemies shared bread, laughter, and forgiveness, and the world became human again." That was the true legacy of Camp Hereford. Not barbed wire or guard towers, but the invisible bridge that stretched across nations, built on compassion, courage, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. History remembers the battles, the leaders, the guns. But in the heart of Texas, where cowboys once taught prisoners to ride, the real victory was written not in blood, but in trust. Because sometimes the greatest act of power is mercy,